My name is Scott Taylor. I'm a field sales representative with Bayer Crop Science here in the Upper Gulf Coast of Texas. I'm joined today by Dr. Greg Steele, who's a technology development representative with our crop protection business, Scott Stanislav, a technical agronomist for South Texas, and Dr. Luke Pruter, a technology development representative with our seed and traits business. We're today sitting in a cotton field, and here in the Upper Gulf Coast, we've had quite a few challenges so far this year in terms of cotton. The weather has not been our friend, right? We've had excessive rain in the month of May. Today's June the 10th, and we're finally starting to build up some heat. The sun's been out for a few days now with no rainfall, and so maybe things will turn around a bit on this cotton. But Scott, let's talk about the effects of all this rain that we've had. In some parts of the Upper Coast, we've had 35 plus inches of rain since the 1st of May. A lot of these cotton fields went underwater, and some underwater for 2-3 days at a time. Talk to us about what this oversaturation, what kind of impact it can have on the cotton, and where do we go from here?
Right. So basically, across the whole area, I mean, we had huge amounts of rainfall and on some cotton that was still pretty small, right, and really not that old. And so, of course, prolonged periods of wet, water standing, waterlogged soils. I mean, you get down to it and we're basically replacing the pore space with water instead of the oxygen that the plant needs to carry on its normal processes, respiration, and things like that. So once we deplete the soil of oxygen and we replace it with water, we start running into basically very slowed growth. Photosynthesis drops quite drastically within the plant, and so we really, number one thing is that we're delaying maturity, right? We went through 3-4 weeks of saturated conditions in a lot of areas, and you can see that now. We didn't progress with the crop like we typically would, and so unfortunately, in this part of the country, you deal with those September storms, rainy season, hurricanes, things like that, and we obviously want to try and get it out timely. Now, since we've been set back so far, unfortunately, on some of these acres that are starting to grow, starting to take back off, it's just going to take time to make cotton and to a yield level that you would want. And so, there's been some situations this year with this waterlogging and prolonged wetness, and we really have some cotton that's really hurt. It will grow. I think, the first thing you got to think about, we've probably lost some nitrogen in those situations. It's hard to say how much, to what degree, because you've got different periods of wetness, how long water stood, how fast it got off, things like that. But we definitely lost some nitrogen because those microbes within the soil, when they don't have oxygen, they feed off the available nitrate that's in the soil to basically survive. And so that's basically what you talk about when you talk about denitrification within the soil. And so there's going to be some situations where it would probably warrant some supplemental nitrogen to try and kick that crop back off and get it growing very well. And I think the next question that comes up is, in those situations, is they want to go out, or a grower may want to go out real quick and start putting out some kind of PGR on it because we know we have plentiful moisture, we're warm now, we're sunny. And so really, if you're in a situation where that crop has been stunted and slowed very much down due to that water, I would advise on giving that crop some time to kind of kick back off and let the plant get a chance to regrow. And so before we go out and we start making some real heavy PGR applications, for sure. We get questions a lot where this water has stood, should I go out and cultivate, things like that, to try and open it back up. And really, at the same time, when you're in those soil conditions, your roots are really proliferating up towards the surface to try to get to where there is some kind of oxygen. And so in a lot of situations, you could probably damage the crop more than you could do it good in those situations of wanting to cultivate. Now, depending on how you're set up with it and all that kind of thing, you may be able to do that, but I usually highly advise against trying to do that because of how shallow the root system will have gotten under those kinds of conditions.
So Greg, let's back up a little bit now and talk about some weed control options. So it's very, very important this year that you had something out pre-emergent early, kind of clean that field up. And now that we've had all this rain, there's a lot of flush of weeds and grasses coming. So let's talk about some weed control options for this cotton.
Sure, and again, I kind of want to back up and, we've talked a lot about the conditions we've encountered this year and this year, but I think we also need to consider what are our options in more of a normal year too, right? So just kind of walk through our options and sort of some of the programs that we've been successful with. I like to start early to really kind of front load that program so that we're set up for a situation to where we're not having to deal with these flushes of weeds post-emergence. So starting clean with tillage or some type of burn down application. We've actually been real successful with pre-plant applications of a product like Warrant Ultra or even Valor, which is also part of our Bayer Plus rewards. So starting pre-plant with that application, that gives us a good residual control to where we can plant into a clean seed bed. And typically, a lot of times in that situation, if we're clean at planting, we can actually get by without a true pre-emerge and then plan on coming back with a very early post-emergence application. It does a couple of different things. We make that early application really when weeds are very small, so we have a better opportunity to control those small weeds. And also, if we get any type of burn from that post application, sometimes we'll see a little speckling with Warrant. And typically on that younger cotton, it's very, very transient. So come in with that early application, and that's really ideally would be a three-way combination of a Roundup, of Warrant, and of XtendiMax, plus all of our DRAs and VRAs that we need to add to that tank mix, obviously. And then subsequent applications, we've got opportunities to come in back post-emerge with additional applications of Roundup XtendiMax. We have opportunity to apply Liberty in crop as well. So that's sort of the typical program. And then a lot of growers have kind of their own combinations they use for lay-by applications. And so we have a lot of flexibility on tank mix partners that we can use late season as a lay-by as well.
So Greg, let's talk more specifics about XtendiMax and the application from a timing standpoint and also from a usage rate standpoint, pre and post.
Yeah, so I think a couple of important things to just kind of consider, especially in a year like this where we might need some late applications of XtendiMax. Just some important things around the label. So one of the new things on the new XtendiMax label is that we actually have a calendar date that's a cutoff for us in this geography in XtendFlex cotton, and that's July 31st. So we need to make sure that if we're getting out there with some late applications of XtendiMax, that occurs before that July 31st cutoff date. As far as maximum use rates, again, that was another little change to the label, is that our maximum single application rate is 22 ounces. Total application rates were allowed a total of 44 ounces prior to planting and a total of 44 ounces in crop. So a maximum of basically 2 applications prior to planting and 2 applications in crop.
Okay. Very good. So we've got some flexibility there, but we need to wait because on the way the crop is shaping up, there's a potential for some applications to be needed in August. We've got to maintain that July 31st date. That's the new cutoff on this new 5-year label that we've been granted. So Scott, now let's go back and talk a little more specifics about growth management in this cotton and some of the challenges that we could have now because of the delay in the crop. But let's talk more specific about growth management and the products that we have in our portfolio for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so every variety is going to be different. Every variety grows different. Every variety responds a little bit differently to PGR applications. And so, if we're out looking at some of this cotton and really let the plant tell you when it needs it, okay? If we go up, my favorite way, or what I think is the easiest way to kind of get an idea or a gauge of current growing conditions will be to start at the top of the plant, start with a leaf that's at least the size of a quarter, count down 4 nodes, and measure that internode distance between that 4th and 5th node. That is the node that's going to be the most actively growing at that time. We know if we really start to grow really hard, that node there will be the most active one that's stretching out the most. It almost gets that real rubbery kind of feel to it, where if you push over the top of the plant or over at the terminal, it'll actually stay kind of bent over like that. So we know we're really actively growing very hard. And so, that's obviously a good way to gauge it. We obviously have to look at fruit retention. You know, we get in some conditions, or especially with the rain that we've had in a lot of these conditions, that we might have had some fruit shed, right? You know, real high fruit retention is probably the best plant growth regulator that there is. And so if we have lost a lot of that fruit and we're really starting to grow, we have to think that some of these more aggressive growing varieties are going to potentially be even more aggressive with the lack of that fruit load that we have down there lower on the plant. So, you know, every situation's a little bit different. We'll talk specifics a little more on kind of by variety management after a while, but you know, it's one of those things that it's kind of like defoliating cotton, right? Defoliating cotton's it's always been said it's more of a art as opposed to a science. I'm also kind of feel the same way when it comes to PGRs, because it really takes you to be in the field, looking at the crop, seeing how it's reacting, seeing what it's doing, all those kinds of things. And of course, we know field history. If you've got a field that you just know always can have rank growth, we're going to have to manage harder there, regardless of the variety, than if we're somewhere where growth typically isn't a problem. And so, you know, that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of it, honestly. And of course, you know, we've got a product like Stance that we've gotten out on a lot more acres here over the last couple of years, especially in the southern part of the state. And, you know, Greg, what kind of fill us in on Stance and how that fits in the system?
Right. It's been around for a few years. You know, I think the critical thing was to understand with Stance compared to, you know, traditionally just a mepiquat chloride for plant growth regulator or plant growth management, is that, you know, Stance obviously has very low use rate. Typically we start with a 2-ounce rate and we can move to subsequent 3 or 4 ounce rates depending on what that program looks like. The reason for that is because it's actually a 2 mode of action product. So it not only has mepiquat chloride, but also cyclanolide. And so the key thing there is that rather than just regulating gibberellic acid, we're also regulating auxin transport as well. So we're really acting on that plant in a couple different ways, and that allows us to use those lower use rates. You know, one thing in listening to you talk about this, Scott, I would also add in, my opinion is, in terms of regulating plant growth, cotton growth, I would propose being more proactive as opposed to reactive, right? Because we know that we get in a situation, especially with very aggressively growing varieties, we get some really growthy conditions, and you know, we can you know, chase that all season long and never really get on top of that. So, you know, in a typical Stance program, this year's a little different. Obviously we had stress from kind of waterlogged conditions very early on, but in a normal situation we would actually recommend starting off with just a 2-ounce rate at match head square. Even if we don't really know if we're going to need it or not, let's get that little bit of those active ingredients in that plant, because that makes it so much easier as we come back to manage that growth through scouting and make those other applications. If we've got that little dose in there already, it makes it much more reactive to those subsequent
Absolutely, because any growth management product works off a concentration in the plant, right? And you can build that concentration up a lot easier by getting some in there earlier on, as opposed to trying and chase the rabbit later on down the road, right? And like I always say, or like I always tell people, and I'll stole this from a counterpart in another state, plant growth regulators are kind of like a 401k. If you invest in them early on in life, you get a lot more return on your investment later on, as opposed to trying to play catch up later. Right. And so I'm all for, like you said, Greg, getting started early, get something in the plant early, and it just makes it much easier to manage later on, especially with some of those very aggressive growing varieties.
Right. Very good. So now, Luke, let's talk about the insect pressure. You work all of South Texas, so all the way down into the coastal bend. The crop is probably not as far along as you would expect it there, also due to heavy periods of rain. But what type of insect pressure have you seen, and what can we expect now that this cotton is taken off? The corn will be finishing up, you know, soon enough, but what can we expect then in that transition of pest pressure?
Sure, thank you, Scott. So what I like to do when I look at early cotton is check for thrips, cotton aphids, and spider mites, and that's kind of the early profile season of what I look for. When we're getting into cotton right here, this is actually a really important time to be scouting, because the heliothine complex can rob you of a lot of yield eventually in the year because of right now when these squares are starting to form and you're starting to get the bolls. And what I mean by the heliothione complex is when you have stink bugs, you're going to have flea hoppers, you can have verde plant bug, and all these will be piercing, sucking, and possibly introducing boll rot into these bolls. And so it's a really good time of year to come out here with your beet bucket. And I won't go through how to do it all right now if you look up a tutorial, but it's a great idea to come out here and beet bucket, look for the heliothione complex, because if you get out of control on any of them, they will make a huge difference on your yield at the end of the year. Partial to what you were saying, talking about the Lepidoptera complex, which is going to be your corn earworm. A great way to know whether or not you're going to have a problem with corn earworm in your cotton is to go check in your corn. And when you look at those populations, you can know that they're pretty much going to translate to cotton. Once you cut down that corn, their favorite crop, they're going to move into the cotton. So it's something that you definitely want to get out, beet bucket, count what you got, write it down, make sure you know what you have, and then decide based on the math whether or not you're going to actually trigger a spray.
So Scott, talking about bollworms or the corn earworm coming into cotton, let's talk a little bit about genetics and the technology that we have in our portfolio. So Bollgard 3 versus Bollgard 2, what do we get out of the Bollgard 3 versus Bollgard 2?
Absolutely. And so, you know, of course, we're mostly moving on to that Bollgard 3 trait package for the most part with what we commercially sell. But, you know, at the same time, we still sell a lot of Deltapine 1646, Bollgard 2 XtendFlex. And so, especially in this area, because of the performance. And, you know, so with the Bollgard 3, and we'll speak to some specifics on varieties here in a little bit, but, you know, with the Bollgard 3, you're basically getting the Bollgard 2 plus the Viptera trait. And so, you know, up to this point, not that you don't need to scout those fields any different than you would a Bollgard 2 field, but to Luke's point, you know, as we look at some of these corn earworm populations in the corn crop, and in some areas it's pretty high, right? And so we know where they're headed to next, and we know that if we're going to have to call an overspray on something, that more times than not, it's probably going to end up being in that 1646. And so really key in on those fields, those areas. If you've got a lot of 1646 out there, I think most people in the upper Gulf Coast have kind of been trained to say, hey, we know where we need to look when we start getting those moth flights into these cotton fields, and let's look at 1646 first, and that's what we need to be doing.
Very good. So, you know, the cotton crop, we're a little behind where we'd like to be this time of year. We've got a long way to go with the cotton crop, and from a harvest standpoint, it's looking to be a later harvest than we've had in the last few years. So I appreciate you guys taking time to visit with us here we're in Needville, Texas, in the upper Gulf Coast, and thank you.